Ciao and welcome to a new class. I'm Giulia and today we're going to talk about ISO and noise. Let's dive in. ISO is one of the three pillars of exposure alongside aperture and shutter speed. And today I'm going to explain to you what it is, what it does, and what is digital noise. ISO measures how sensitive the sensor is to light, helping you achieve the right exposure. It also controls how much grain your image will have. Here we have three examples. The first example was shot with bright natural light, lots of it, so I could keep my ISO low, therefore ensuring optimal quality for my image. In the second example, however, I was shooting in a dark restaurant, therefore I had low light, very low natural light. I had to increase my ISO. That meant that my image was a little bit grainy. In the third example, I shot that in a studio with flash, and flash gives me the optimal conditions to shoot at the optimal ISO for optimal image quality. So what is ISO? The ISO is a range of values and it's measured in numbers. Native ISO is basically depends on your camera brand and model, but it basically means it's the range of values that your camera will have as standard values. Oftentimes they go from 100 to 6,400. That's generally the average ISO range, native ISO range for the majority of camera brands and models. Some of the higher end pro models will have a wider range, but generally speaking, that's the range of ISO values that your camera will come with. Base ISO is the lowest end of this range. So if your range goes from ISO 100 to 6400, the base ISO will be 100. Some cameras have a base ISO of 200, so make sure to check this in your camera manual. Extended ISO is basically all of the other ISO values that are outside of the native ISO range. Some cameras will say that their native ISO range is between 100 and 6400, and their extended range is between, I don't know, let's say 50 and 12,800. So all of these numbers that are lower than 100 and higher than 6400, or whatever those numbers are for your camera model, those are extended. That's the extended ISO range. Now, what does it measure? What does this number tell us? Basically, it tells us how much light your sensor can record. Your pixels, so your sensor is made out of little pixels. Each of these pixels can capture and record a certain amount of light. The higher the ISO number, the more light that pixel can record. However, it's not in an optical way that the pixel records this light. It's in a digital way, meaning the signal, the digital signal that the pixels send to the sensor and the camera is amplified by the ISO value. Therefore, shooting at a higher ISO value means that the pixel signal, the digital signal, is amplified. And with this, with amplifying signals, electrical digital signals, there are some consequences that I will tell you about in a minute. So how do you set the ISO on your camera? If you're shooting in shutter priority mode, what happens is that you will set the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera will take care of the aperture in order to give you the correct exposure. On the other hand, in aperture priority mode, you will be able to set the aperture and the ISO, and the camera will set the shutter speed to achieve the correct exposure. When you're shooting in these semi-automatic modes, you can tell the camera to have a set auto ISO range, so that you can basically set both your shutter speed and your aperture, and the camera will take care of setting the ISO for you. You can tell the camera not to go below a certain ISO value and not to go above a certain ISO value. So for example, you can set your camera on auto ISO to choose anything between 100 and 6400, which is maybe your native ISO, so that you can make sure that the camera will not increase your ISO too much, therefore giving you a lot of noise. I will explain this in a second as well. And also, obviously, you can set your ISO in manual mode, because in manual mode you can control all of the three pillars of exposure. You will be able to control aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all by yourself. The camera doesn't do anything automatically. Now, setting the ISO this way obviously will change your exposure. As I said, this is one of the three pillars of exposure, of the exposure triangle. So if you don't change any of the other settings, then having a higher ISO will let in more light than having a lower ISO. Lower ISO equals less light. Higher ISO equals more light. So in these two examples, my other settings, the shutter speed and the aperture, stayed exactly the same. Shutter speed 1/200 of a second and aperture 5.6. Same for both images. However, in this first image here on the left, my ISO was at 100. So my image is darker, obviously, because a low ISO means you let in less light. Your sensor can record less light. While here, I increased my ISO to 200, and as you can see, the image is brighter. And obviously, personally, I like the exposure on the right. But this is just an example to make you understand that ISO changes the exposure if the other two values stays the same. So you can use your ISO to change your exposure. So you might say, if increasing my ISO and using a high ISO number will increase my exposure, why don't I always shoot at ISO 3200, for example? You should always aim to shoot at the lowest possible ISO, because shooting at a high ISO has a cost, and the cost is basically digital noise or grain. What happens is, when you shoot with high ISO, you're amplifying the digital signal that the pixels are sending to your sensor and your software in the camera. Amplifying the signal increases the distortion, basically. The more you amplify the signal, the more the signal gets distorted. And in photography terms, this distortion is basically visible grain. So you will notice that some pixels have like weird colors, and the image is not as sharp, and that's because the digital signal is amplified and distorted by the amplification. So it's not good to shoot at high ISO. You should always aim to shoot at low ISO. Here is a visual example of what ISO does to your image. So here's my image on the left, and then here there are two zoomed in, basically, details of the image. The middle one was shot at ISO 100, so very low ISO, base ISO, which gives me a very high image quality. Like, the image is sharp and crisp, and there is no grain and no distortion. In the image on the right, however, I shot this at ISO 3200, which is a very high ISO value. And what happens is that you can visibly see how the image quality is a lot lower. There's lots of grain, lots of digital noise. It's not as sharp. The edges aren't as crisp. It looks a lot worse. So shooting at high ISO has a cost. You should always aim to stick to low ISO, as low as possible, as much as possible. In order to be able to do that, you have to use a tripod so that you can slow down your shutter speed. Again, in order to keep your exposure correct or in the range that you want, you have to sacrifice either your shutter speed, your aperture, or your ISO. If you have a tripod, then what happens is that you can slow down your shutter speed, therefore that allows you to use a very low ISO. So that allows you to use the base ISO. Using the base ISO is generally the best choice because it gives you optimal image quality. And just to repeat the concept, the base ISO is the lower value on the native ISO range that your camera has. Every camera is different, so check yours. Sometimes you are going to need to use a slightly higher ISO for different reasons. One of the reasons might be that you don't have a tripod with you. Sometimes it happens that I shoot in restaurants and I'm just shooting handheld, which is absolutely fine. However, you need to be wary that you obviously, without a tripod, you can't slow down your shutter speed too much, otherwise you will get camera shake. Therefore, you're gonna have to increase your ISO to make sure that the exposure is the right one. So you might have to increase your ISO if you don't have tripod to avoid camera shake. Another instance when you have to, or you might have to increase your ISO is if you're trying to freeze the action. So if you want to create action shots, your camera might be on a tripod. However, in order to create action shots and freeze the action, you have to use a very fast shutter speed. A faster shutter speed means less light comes in the camera. Therefore, you have to increase your ISO to let more light in so that it kind of balances it out. The fast shutter speed lets in less light, and the higher ISO compensates for the light that the shutter speed is not letting in. So sometimes if you want to freeze action, and especially if you don't have enough natural light, you might have to increase your ISO to make sure that your shutter speed is okay. Because what happens is that if you get camera shake, your image is irrecoverable. Like you can take it and throw it in the bin. If your photo is blurry, there's nothing you can do to recover it. While with noise, if you increase your ISO and you get a bit of noise, there is something you can do, and I will show you in a minute. So always remember that if you have to sacrifice something in order to capture more light while you're exposing your image, always or try and sacrifice your ISO instead of sacrificing your shutter speed, because a grainy image is recoverable and it's better than a blurry image. A blurry image is not recoverable. So how do we recover from using high ISO? There are some tricks. We have some tricks up our sleeves. Lightroom does magic with its noise reduction tool. This is what the panel looks like, basically. And it allows you to, this panel here called noise reduction, it allows you to get rid of some of your noise. So Lightroom is a software that will analyze the image, take the noise and make it smoother, basically, and make it look like it's disappearing. For the best chances to recover a grainy image, you have to expose to the right. What does expose to the right mean? So have a look at the histogram lesson that we have, and you will know that the highlights are on the right of your histogram and the shadows are on the left of your histogram. exposing to the right simply means that you have to overexpose your image slightly instead of underexposing it. Why is this? Why does overexposing our image give us the best noise reduction? Because when you're overexposing, what happens is that your pixels are capturing a lot of information from your scene. And then when you bring down the exposure in Lightroom, you're simply getting rid of some of that information, therefore making that signal smoother, therefore not getting any noise. If you're doing the opposite and if you underexpose your image, your pixels do not capture enough information from your scene. Therefore, when you go back into Lightroom and you increase the exposure, the software just has to make up for the loss of information. Those pixels don't have the information, therefore the software has to make it up. And by making it up, it can be distorted, that information, because it basically has to invent it from create it from nothing. And that is not a good thing. By doing that, you get a lot of distortion. And as I explained, distortion in photography translates to digital noise. So in order to be able to recover as much noise as possible, if you're forced to shoot with high ISO, always overexpose your images a little bit. Not much, otherwise you end up burning your highlights and clipping your highlights, but try and expose towards the right of the histogram. Another trick is to only stick to your native ISO range. So try not to use the extended ISO range, because again, the extended ISO range is basically just the software of your camera amplifying that signal, pumping it, and again, by doing that, it distorts it and it translates in a lot of grain and a lot of noise. Here is a visual example of how the noise reduction panel can help. This is my image here on the left. I shot this image at ISO 3200 because it looks nice and bright, but the restaurant was actually dark and gloomy and London, so not much natural light, unfortunately. So this is how the image came out of the camera, basically. This is without any noise reduction, just with a few basic adjustments in Lightroom. On the right, we can see what the noise reduction is capable of doing. So basically, here I can see all of the pixels and I can see lots of grain in my image, especially in my shadows over here. And after applying the noise reduction, it's all smooth and it's all nice. So if you are forced to shoot at high ISO, the noise reduction tool in Lightroom can help. Why did I shoot at such high ISO? Not only because I didn't have enough natural light, but also because this is an action shot. I wanted to capture and freeze the action and the drops of lemon and have a look, because we have another class on this. But basically, in order to freeze the action, you need to use a fast shutter speed. And my shutter speed here was 2000. So in order for me to have the right exposure, by setting a shutter speed that fast, I wasn't letting in a lot of light. So I had to increase my ISO to compensate the exposure and make up for the loss of light. So now the good news with Flash, when you shoot with Flash, all of the worries about noise, the worries about having to increase your ISO, all of that almost disappears, because what happens is that Flash is such a fast and bright burst of light that basically you can keep your ISO always low. You can always keep your ISO at the basic value, so either 100 or 200, depending on your camera, and that will make sure that you have the optimal image quality. So no noise, absolutely no noise. If you need more light, what Flash allows you to do is that you just increase the power of the flash, you don't have to adjust your ISO or increase your ISO, therefore getting rid of all the noise. So if you use flash, the problems and the worries about noise will magically disappear. So to recap the ISO, here is a little cheat sheet for you. ISO measures the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So how sensitive the sensor is to light. If we have a small number, the sensor is less sensitive to light, which means there's less light coming in. That also means there's less noise and your image will have no grain. While if we have a high number, the sensor is more sensitive to light, which means it will capture more light. However, we will also have more noise and more grain, therefore losing some quality in our image. So that's all for today. I hope you found that useful and make sure to tune in next time. Ciao!